Okay. All right. Well, let's jump back in to Henri Bergson, Introduction to Metaphysics. I trust that you guys have finished it by now.
Hmm.
Good. Okay. Why don't one or both of you summarize where we left off, some of the things you remember, and then we'll move into some of the new things that you read this time.
Can
You,
someone resend me the PDF? Because my PDF like got corrupted or something. I can't open it.
that's weird. Yeah, just a second. Let's find it. Um, okay, let's see. Uh, well, I'll send you this one, which has a bunch of highlighting on it, but hopefully it's good enough.
Oh, actually, I got it. Sorry, I don't know what happened, but I was able to find it in preview.
It did open it. Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's not worry about it then. All right. Since you spoke up, Justin, why don't we start with some summary of where we left off?
Um, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what we covered that I hadn't read last time and
Well,
what I just read for this week. But
yeah.
yeah, I think we were talking about um the oh yeah, we were talking about like his critique of psychologists, the different schools of psychology, how they both fundamentally miss the issue of getting the sense of a whole person by taking these mental states and either sort of uh putting together these mental states in a way that like trends to infinity but never captures the whole essence of a person,
Well,
or
let's be
either.
really clear now. There are two specific directions in psychology, which, I mean, we're talking about psychology at the turn of the 20th century. So it's a little bit different from what we might mean when we say psychology today. Really, I suppose what he's doing is saying that there are two major philosophical traditions that have a psychological aspect. Um, and he does mention a few names in one of them, and then the other, he doesn't really mention anybody in particular. So I think it's probably more accurate to describe it in terms of philosophical traditions, even though he does use the word psychology. But really, what he's talking about is within these philosophical traditions, what is their theory of mind? What is their theory of selfhood? Right. So when you're saying like the whole person, really, actually, what you're talking about is what is the theory of self in these two traditions, right? And what are the two traditions?
So rationalism and empiricism.
Yeah, yeah. Um, how much, Sanders, you should be able to give us a nice definition that distinguishes between empiricism and rationalism as philosophical movements. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, go
Uh,
ahead.
well, um, I guess Hume would fall under as
Yeah, let's start really generally. I mean, this is
yeah,
a good history of philosophy sort of lesson, but if we ever end up reading Deleuze, you're going to need to know a lot about the history of philosophy.
yeah.
Um,
Like
so let's
empirical.
let's first let's just first think about the terms empiricism and rationalism. What so really the thing that most strikingly distinguishes them is their claims about where knowledge comes from or under what conditions is knowledge possible. And how can we describe the difference as regards that question?
Yeah. So for empiricists, knowledge comes from experience.
Hmm.
So experience is prior to knowledge, and we gain concepts and just knowledge about the world based on like sense data and how we experience a certain how we experience the world. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
Yeah, I will say a couple things. I mean, there are a wide variety of thinkers in the empiricist tradition. It tends to be more of an English um,
Mm.
sort of tradition. Most of the empiricists were from I mean, in the 18th century, were from the British Isles, and then, in the 20th century, empiricism is something that describes a lot of analytic philosophy.
Mhm.
In particular, analytic philosophy that was influenced by the movement of logical positivism, which also goes by the name logical empiricism,
Mhm.
which suggests that maybe there are innate ideas, like maybe there are certain things that are just kind of there as a basic canvas. Uh, John Locke refers to the mind as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, but the thing is, it's still a slate, right? In other words, it's still subject to some constraints, right? So it's not that all knowledge just comes from experience, because I don't think that that position would be coherent. You
Mhm.
know, if it were coherent, then any light sensor, some cheap piece of plastic or whatever that you put out in the sun would have knowledge,
Mhm.
right? Um, but you're right that one huge part of it is that empiricists always claim that knowledge is only possible if it can be verified by experience or by observation, right? And so it's this idea that, well, yeah, there probably are some innate ideas. Um, Hume refers to them more in terms of habituation, right? So, we presumably have some kind of faculty for memory such that we can compare this experience to that experience, or this experience at time t to this experience time t prime, or whatever. But that sort of memory is not really, it doesn't really tap into some kind of mind independent true description of reality, right?
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
just a habit of mind that maybe we use as a sort of labor saving device, a cognitive labor saving device. But
Mhm.
uh, all of the I suppose that one important distinction between Locke and Hume, who are both empiricists, is that Locke has more of a positive project. He's trying to make an argument for how knowledge is possible,
Mhm.
whereas Hume is more of a skeptical writer. And so he's more interested in saying, look, there are all these things that we take for granted as necessarily being the case, and yet we don't actually have any justification for that. Um, Right. So that's empiricism. It's very heavily tied uh, to observation or experience. Not that it's the only way that we get some kind of knowledge, but that any knowledge we have has to be subject to experiential verification. And then what about rationalism?
Yeah, but rationalism, I'm a little more, I guess, hazy. So, do rationalists think that there are some uh, pre sort of installed uh, maybe categories like Kant, for example? We have
Mhm.
these categories of understanding and a priori intuitions, and the
Mhm.
the what the subject brings to the world is what creates the objects of experience. Is that what rationalism
That's
means?
correct. Well, Kant's really hybrid. Because
Yeah.
is heavily indebted to Hume and empiricism as well. So like if you think of like in early modern philosophy from say whatever, Descartes up until I don't know, the 19th century or so, you can really think of two strands of thought, rationalistic thought and empirical thought. And
Mhm.
they kind of think of them as like being in an X because they have histories that continue in both directions, but right in the center of the X is Kant.
Yeah.
And so, um, very often, um, I don't know if it's really totally apt, but I think that one way of thinking about the distinction between empiricism and rationalism can sort of be characterized in terms of the distinction between Anglo-American or analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. That analytic philosophy tends to be more influenced, or is more aptly described as a descendant of empiricism, and continental philosophy tends to be more of a descendant of rationalism. And so there are all sorts of examples of that that I could give. I won't waste time with that. But the point is that, these traditions, you can think of them as predating Kant, but they also postdate Kant in a certain way. I mean, there are people that continue in the rationalist tradition after Kant and also with the empiricist tradition. But Kant is often referred to as the last common ancestor,
Uh,
of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. So he's kind of like right in the middle.
yeah.
So some more paradigmatic examples of rationalists would be like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, but then also Hegel and the German idealists after Kant are more in the rationalist side of things. And it's mostly because they think that, well, it depends on who you read, but like if you're talking about Descartes actually thinks that perceptions are actually just cognitions. In other words, that um, whenever you perceive something, really what's going on is that you have a variety of concepts interacting that give rise to a further concept, this experience of this thing, right? So that's like really strong rationalism. And empiricists, so rationalists, like the strong rationalists, people like Descartes, and I suppose you could even sort of describe Hegel in this way, describe concepts, or basically rational thinking, as the sole source of knowledge, whereas empiricists tend to think there are really two streams of knowledge. There's ideas and perceptions, right? So that was a very rough kind of background, but that's sort of the idea. And so, if I were to list a couple different intellectual traditions outside philosophy, I would want you to then guess what philosophical movement do you think most closely fits? Okay. So if I say mathematics, and it's just a big field of stuff, which philosophical movement is perhaps the more apt one to describe the basic assumptions in the field of mathematics? What would you say? Empiricism or rationalism?
Rationalism?
Rationalism, right. And what about natural science? Let's say, I don't know, whatever, chemistry or something. I mean, empiricism will, any science that requires observation to make a knowledge claim owes a debt to empiricism. Mathematics doesn't require observation to make knowledge claims because it's a purely formal science, right? So you don't have to go out in the world and look at every object that is singular and then put them together and say, huh, this time did they equal two? And then, you get two different objects and it's like, oh, this time they equal two. And so then, you inductively infer from that 1 + 1 = 2. No, you just know that because of the definitions of the terms. So that's a rational science as opposed to an empirical science, which requires observation. But again, the point is that even in chemistry or physics or whatever, you also need to have some kind of theoretical framework to fit the observations in, right? It's just that you can't read. This is, by the way, a claim that Bergson makes about Kant, which is totally unjustified. He doesn't really understand Kant in certain respects. One of the things that he accuses Kant of is the idea that you could read the entirety of physics and the laws of nature off of the mind. In other words, if you think hard enough about it, you could know all of physics. That's a claim he makes about Kant, and that is totally false. Kant claims exactly the opposite, that you could never know all of physics simply by doing lots of math or just thinking really hard. You need to go out and look to verify the knowledge claims. So yeah, that's, I hope, a decent way of distinguishing between these two things. So back to the question of then, okay, within the tradition of empiricism and rationalism, we have these two different, basic approaches to the question, what is the self? Is there a self? If so, how do we know about it? How do we have access to it? And so on. And Justin, you want to, in the light of all of that summary, maybe come back to that question now?
Yeah, sure. So Bergson obviously criticizes both empiricists and rationalists for saying that they're actually more similar than they are different,
Mhm.
because they both make the same error, but just from two different angles.
Mhm.
And I highlighted some things where he sums it up well. I'm trying to see if I can
Yeah.
uh, find it, but
Well, let's
but yeah,
start with just one. Let's just start with one or the other. That'll be easier.
sure. Yeah, so the empiricist he claims try to sort of find the
Well,
um
here's one way to start. I've often told um Sandesh that when we summarize arguments, it's best to often start off by thinking like a car mechanic or like a really kind of like, you know, almost apply a rigid grid. And then the more nuanced and interesting and specific the questions get, the more the grid will break down, or maybe the more like subdivisions of the grid will pop up, who knows? But here's one way to address the question. Do empiricists think there is a self, that the self exists? Yes or no?
uh I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's quite clear in the way that Bergson is characterizing empiricism, what they think. Yeah, do you have an answer to that, Sandesh?
Yeah, I think they think that the self. Um, well, no, I don't. I think they're trying to arrive at the unity of the self after the division process, um,
Mhm.
right? So what empiricists do is they first take a person, and then there's a division process where they try to arrive at the essence of the self by breaking down into different mental states. Uh,
Mhm.
and he thinks this process of division is flawed. And he says
Mhm.
the same with the rationalists, they do the opposite, where they take the divided parts and then try to group them together to arrive at a unity of self. So it's the opposite, going from it's like a process of addition as opposed to a process of division, I guess.
Yeah, let me see if I can find the exact quote. I'm right in the section here. You're basically right. Let's just put it in Bergson's own words. Let's see. It's
Page 32, I guess. Second.
yeah, I have a different PDF, but it's right around the well, he goes on and on about it for several paragraphs. I think it's somewhere in the paragraph starting empiricists say quite rightly. Uh, let's see. Okay, well, this is close enough. Although he says it pretty emphatically a few times, and this isn't the most emphatic way he says it. But in any case, he's talking about empiricists. So this is towards the bottom of the paragraph saying the empiricists say quite rightly
Hmm.
where that is. Are you on that
Mhm.
paragraph? Okay, and then the last two sentences or so, last three sentences. Okay, they look for the ego. Is the sentence starting here? They look for the ego, which is really the self, right? It's this, the conscious, um, unified sense. So, like when Kant says that uh, he must posit that the I think adheres to all of his cognitions. What he's saying is that anytime you have any experience, you always have, in addition to the experience, the sense that it's your experience. And that's third personal or disembodied sort of experience that doesn't have some kind of possessive quality to it. It's always my experience. I suppose maybe if you have schizophrenia or something, sometimes that breaks down. But for the most part, people have the sense whenever they experience anything that one, it's all experiences are tied together in a single consciousness, and two, that consciousness is my consciousness, right? So that's the idea of the self that he's working with here. And so he says that the empiricists look for the ego, and they claim to find it in psychical states, though this diversity of states has itself only been obtained and could only be obtained by transporting oneself outside the ego altogether, so as to make a series of sketches, notes, and more or less symbolic and schematic diagrams. Then, thus, however much they place the states side by side, multiplying points of contact and exploring the intervals, the ego always escapes them, so that they finish by seeing in it nothing but a vain phantom. And later on, he says, just because they can't sort of catch it or describe it or analyze it in terms of these states, mental states, they say it doesn't exist. And that's a fairly common logical error where you cannot prove the existence of something, and then you move from an inability to prove the existence of something to a claim about the non-existence of that thing. So like, for instance, if an atheist says, well, you can't prove that God exists, therefore God doesn't exist. Well, that's a logical error, right? And it's a logical error that people make all the time. And it's the sort of logical error that very often won't be actually contained in the writing of a specific, careful thinker. Someone like Hume is very careful about the claims he makes, will often not make the claim that the self doesn't exist. It's more sort of a claim that comes out of the social influence of these theories. Sometimes there are people that really do have an agenda where they want to say, no, there is no God or there is no self or whatever. And so, try to simply shift the burden from themselves. So if I say there is no evidence for the self, and then from that I immediately claim, therefore there is no self, I have the burden of demonstrating that there is no self. But there are all sorts of ways that in an argument, even though I want to claim that there is no self, I can phrase it in such a way that the other party that wants to claim that there is a self has the burden of demonstrating that there is a self, right? So like, for instance, right, let's see, if I say, well, there is no evidence, let's say we're, sometimes it'll just be the terms of the debate, like I'm claiming that there is no self and you're claiming that there is a self, and then I set up the argument in such a way that there's a question that you have to respond to, but in responding to it, you have to claim that there is the self. And then I would say, okay, well, what's your evidence for that? Even though I don't have any evidence that there is none, right? That's called burden shifting. And so very often that's the way that people claim their position, even if there's no proof one way, no evidence one way or the other. They do it simply by shifting the burden to the other party that wants to claim the opposite or something like that. But in any case, that's what Bergson is saying is happening in empiricism, that, so we have observations. Well, what are observations? Observations are mental states, according to empiricists. And it's important here to understand that the idea of a mental state is indebted to substance thinking. Why is that?
So it assumes that a mental state is a thing.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, and in fact, it's right there in the word state as, something that's related to the word static, right? That there's some way of defining an observation or a thought or a sensation or whatever in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, that it can be delimited like a term that has an identity and so on. If you think about mental activity in terms of duration or whatever, then you probably wouldn't describe it in terms of states. But in any case, the empiricists, this is basically, I was describing it in terms of David Hume's bundle theory of the self, which is that, okay, so we think that any knowledge claim, it's a little bit more complicated than just saying any knowledge claim. There are certain knowledge claims that don't require observation. Like if I say, um, 1 = 1 or something like that, that's a knowledge claim. I know that 1 = 1, but I don't have to look at the world, right? But knowledge claims that are supposed to be not derivable just from the meaning of terms. Like if I know what 1 means and I know what equals means, then I can derive that 1 = 1. But the question about whether or not there's a self is supposed to be the sort of thing where you would actually have to look at the world, because from the definition of, say, sensation or experience or something like that, you don't have to include the self in the definition, right? You can't just infer that there is a self because of the definition of sensation, for instance, right? Okay, so those kinds of knowledge claims for the empiricists have to be verified by experience. Okay. And so what David Hume does is, okay, well, if the knowledge claim about whether or not there is a self is the sort that needs to be verified by experience, then I'll just observe all of my mental states. Right? Okay, well, I have this sensation, I have this thought, I have maybe this memory or whatever, whatever. I've got, you could do it yourself. Just think about everything that you're thinking about or experiencing or whatever. And then ask, is there a further mental state or a further perception that I have that's not just those perceptions I'm having, but is the further perception of a self? And what Hume says, no, there isn't. All I have are those mental states that I actually have, and not a further, there is no thing that I would be able to perceive or experience that is the self. The self would be perhaps maybe something like the act of perceiving or something like that. But I think that what Hume wants to say is that there isn't really any difference between perceiving and the act of perceiving. Right? So that if I have a perception, that's what I have. I don't have the perception plus the act of perceiving it. Right? It's not two different things, it's just the same thing. And so he's not able to locate any self by observing his mental states, right? And that's what Bergson is talking about here, where it's like, okay, so if you're really just enumerating your mental states, I mean, there are a couple problems, right? One, you're turning something that is durational activity, sensation, thinking, etc., into objects, into things, right? So it's moving from duration to substance, but then you say that, okay, since I'm able to enumerate all these mental states, and there's no further state that I would call the self, therefore the self doesn't exist. Right? So that's what's going on in the critique of empiricism. What about
The enumeration?
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just have one. So the enumeration of the different mental states,
Yeah.
would Bergson say that those are conceived and not perceived? Because what you're perceiving is like a continuous,
yeah, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, yeah, I guess the question is, I mean, it's tricky because even if I call my perception percepts, I'm still turning them into things, right? But you're basically right. I mean, the problem is that what both rationalism and empiricism are doing, one of the problems is that they're turning activity into things, right? So that really, if you think about like, okay, I'm in the midst of constant sensation, constant awareness, all this sort of thing, but my awareness is never the same. My experience, my perceptions are never the same from one moment to the next. They're not distinct exactly. They're not like, it's not like I have this perception at time one and this perception at time two and this perception at time three. It's continuous, but it's a continuous heterogeneity, right? It's that what I perceive at time one is not the same thing that I perceive at time n, but they're also not distinct, right? They're qualitatively different, but they're not quantitatively different. It's just this constant single stream, right? Okay. So yeah, I mean, he would say that, well, no, the problem is that in your question, it's a false choice, according to Bergson, because either percepts or concepts are things, right? I would say that, you can think of perceiving as a stream. You could also think of conceptual thinking as a stream, I suppose, right? And that's really what he's trying to get to. Um, yeah, so then what's the problem? So it turns out that after Hume, I suppose in the 19th century, by the 20th century, there aren't really any people that I'm aware of in the empiricist tradition that really even ask the question, is there a self? It's taken to be, I mean, by the time you get to logical positivism, there's sort of a doctrine in logical positivism that they take from Wittgenstein. Well, they don't necessarily take it from Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein sums up the idea in a very succinct way when he says that which can be said clearly. That which cannot be said clearly, we must pass over in silence, right? So again, that's a situation where he's not claiming that things like the self or God or values or these kinds of things don't exist. It's just that philosophy will always fail because it's not the sort of thing that can be converted into analytical concepts or that sort of thing. The logical positivists, however, at least as their thought is characterized by this guy, A.J. Ayer. So really interesting 20th century philosopher who was a logical positivist. He wrote a book when he was in his late 20s, I think, called Language, Truth, and Logic, and became famous for that, which is the most sort of crystallized doctrine of the logical positivist system. He later came to disavow it because it seemed, in his own words, obviously false. And just one last thing that's interesting about A.J. Ayer, towards the end of his life, he was at a party somewhere in London. Do you know who Robin Givens is or was? I think she's still alive. She was a singer, dancer, but she was also Mike Tyson's girlfriend for a while.
Oh.
And they were at a party, and A.J. Ayer was also there. And I guess Mike Tyson was like on the verge of getting pretty abusive or something. And A.J. Ayer kind of like put himself in the middle of the situation to de-escalate it. And Tyson was like, "Do you know who I am? I'm like the heavyweight world champion." And then so A.J. Ayer then says, "We are both distinguished in our field, so let us discuss this like reasonable individuals." Anyway, but anyway, one of the things that Ayer writes about in Language, Truth, and Logic uh, um, about logical empiricism is that it's subject to the verification principle of meaning, so that a sentence is only meaningful if it refers to what can, at least in principle, be observed. So the verification is the observation. I forgot why I got on that. It had to do with oh yeah, that's why, yeah. So that's why empiricists in the 20th century didn't really even bother to ask the question, what is the self? Because that's not the sort of thing that is meaningful, because on the verification principle of meaning, if you could never observe whether you have a self, then the question isn't meaningful. It's just nonsense. It doesn't mean anything, right? Um, and a way to ask yourself that is like, what sort of experiment would I run to demonstrate, at least as conclusively as observation allows, that people have selves? I mean, you might be able to demonstrate that people can remember things, or that people maybe can give reports about how they think about themselves or something, but that's not what we want. What we want is an actual observation of the self.
Yeah.
Right. And empiricism basically thinks that you can never do that. And then when you get to logical empiricism, because you can never observe it, the question is actually just meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. Right. Anyway, so that's empiricism on the self. What about rationalism on the self?
So rationalism asserts that there is a self.
Yeah, but what's the problem that it falls into, according to
Uh,
rationalism?
yeah, that you can string together this multiplicity of mental states and arrive at a self, while Bergson asserts that there is something else that's missing.
Yeah, yeah. I spent some time talking about this last week, and maybe it's a kind of complicated idea, but I think it's important to understand what's going on in the analysis here. Sanders, you might have a little bit more insight, just because we've talked about Kant and Adorno and the ineffable and all of this kind of stuff, because the particular way of talking about the ineffable that you know that I draw from Kant and the structure of the infinite judgment or the reflective judgment, and then which I suppose sort of gets picked up in a bunch of different places after Kant. But for instance, when you were talking about Adorno and the non-identical, this sort of thing, this is basically the structure that Bergson is talking about here. And he talks about it as an idea of the self that is form without content, or that is the affirmation of negation. What is that? What does all that mean? If you can kind of put it together, or maybe help Justin put it together, because it's not necessarily such a simple concept, but it's also not that hard to understand.
Is
This
this
is
oh, sorry.
oh, go ahead, Justin. Yeah.
Is this kind of what Bergson is saying when he says, well, how could someone who's a rationalist um, distinguish Peter from Paul?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's not an explanation,
Yeah, no,
right?
I
I mean, yeah, he does say that in the same paragraph, but that doesn't help us any further. What's going on exactly in this whole? Let's see if I can find the right place in the text. Um, it's right around, but rationalism is the dupe of the same illusion. Rationalism persists in affirming the unity of the person. Uh, Okay, nothing. Okay, so I'll just keep reading. Um, okay, so I hope what I just read was pretty straightforward. That rationalism does affirm the unity of the person. The unity of the person is just the self. That's just another name for the self, right? It's true that seeking this unity on the level of psychical states themselves and obliged to put down to the account of these states all the qualities and determinations that it finds by analysis, since analysis, by its very definition, leads to states, nothing is left to the rational analysis of the self. Nothing is left to it for the unity of personality, but something purely negative, the absence of all determination. The psychical states, having necessarily in this analysis taken and kept for themselves everything that can serve as matter, the unity of the ego can never be more than a form without content. Maybe it'll get clearer if I just keep reading. It will be absolutely indeterminate and absolutely void. To these detached psychical states, to these shadows of the ego, the sum of which was for the empiricists the equivalent of the self, rationalism, in order to reconstitute personality, adds something still more unreal, the void in which these shadows move, a place for shadows, one might say. A place for shadows, one might say. The self is a place for shadows. How could this form, which is in truth formless, serve to characterize a living, active, concrete personality or to distinguish Peter from Paul? Okay. Hopefully that's enough context. So there's a lot going on there. And it's maybe not expressed in the most straightforward way, but maybe Sandesh, you can start off by um, telling us what an infinite judgment is in Kant's philosophy. Do you remember? How does it work?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just take a simple example, I guess. So if you take two entities, I guess A and B, A is B is like,
Well, I'd be really careful because what you're talking about is simply predication, which means that unless you think that properties exist independently of the things that they're in, they wouldn't be entities.
oh, okay.
Yeah. So and the from Aristotle on, well, I guess Aristotle didn't write it this way, but it's the same structure. We often talk about predication in terms of S and P. So
Uh-huh.
S is the entity and P is what's predicated of the entity, which would be like the properties and that sort of thing, right? So, and all of Kant's judgments have the form somewhere S is P, and then there are different additions to that, like necessarily S is P, possibly S is P. Uh, if S is P, then S is whatever Q, right? Or all those sorts of things. But the basic structure is S is P, right? Subject is predicate. And the is the copula. It has a very special meaning in Kant
Mhm.
because usually if I say S is P, it sounds like I'm making a descriptive claim about the world. Like this cup S is blue P. Yeah, you got that? You got the structure?
Mhm.
That's just the structure of predication. So all of Kant's judgments in the table of judgments, they all have that structure with different flavors. Okay. So the one addition that, or the one change that Kant makes, he describes this at a few different points, but he says the is of the judgments as constitutive of experience are actually the moment of synthesis.
Mm.
So the idea is like if you take S as P to be a declarative sentence about the world, it seems like I'm just saying there is a matter of fact, and the copula simply brings the elements of the matter of fact together into a thing, right? But what Kant wants to say is that the is isn't really functioning in a declarative way in the way he's thinking about judgments. It's the actual moment of synthesis wherein S and P are brought together
Mm.
through, I guess, the logical structure of judgment. But, the fact that you see this is a cup, it's not like you only see it because you first have the declarative sentence, this is a cup, and then you understand the sentence, and then you apply it to this situation. No, you
Yeah.
just immediately see, oh, there's that object that has those properties.
Right.
So in other words, it immediately shows up to you as unified with its properties, right? And that's what he's talking about, that the judgments aren't it's complicated because judgment plays a bunch of different roles depending on where you are in either um, an analysis of experience or an analysis of description or an analysis of knowledge claims, right? These sorts of things. But at the basic level of experience, judgment functions in a way that has propositional form. It looks like a true or false sentence. Like when I say this cup is blue, that's either true or false. Okay, that the word for that is that it's propositional. This is either, so it is true that this is a blue cup. right? Or it's false if it's not, what Kant is saying is that to the extent that experience is constituted through judgment, um, it is constituted in a way that has propositional form, but is not itself propositional. Because when you see this, it's not like first declare it to be a blue cup and then analyze whether that sentence is true or false. You just see it.
Yeah.
Right. But the idea is that the fact that you're able to use experience to determine whether something that is not experiential, the proposition, you're able to use experience to determine whether the proposition is true or not. Means that the experience must itself have some propositional form in it, even if it's not itself a true or false sentence about experience.
Yeah.
Is that clear? So that's kind of the idea, right? So with all of his judgments, he's got S is P. So he's got it's very complicated. He's got 4 different categories, and then those categories have subcategories. But one of the categories is called quality, and that quality is where you get affirmative, negative, and then infinite judgments, right? And so affirmative is just S is P. And then negative, what do you think negative is, Justin?
S is not P.
S is not P. Infinitive, however, is a little weird. S is non-P. And he says that there's a distinction between S is not P and S is non-P. And the distinction, I always forget how to type logical symbols. There's on Mac, there's not there's not like a shortcut to type the existential quantifier. But it doesn't really matter. I'll just do it with I can do it with the copula instead. Okay, so we've got S is not P, and we've got S is non-P. And if I'm going to put this in, well, I should probably try to get the existential quantifier. Just a second here. If I were going to put this in, yeah, I had it a second though. There it is. Okay. Okay, so okay. So the first of these, according to Kant, looks like this. This is the way you'd symbolize this in predicate calculus, but looks like that. And the second of these looks like this. Okay. So this is not terribly advanced logic or anything, Justin. It just, this little backwards E just means there exists. Okay, and I should say that this is set up as an existential claim and not a claim about judgment as constitutive of experience, but you can see the structure at work here. In the first sentence, you can see that what I'm negating is the existence of an X that has the property P, right? In the second one, I'm saying X exists, but it exists in such a way that it doesn't have property P, right? And the second one is the structure of the infinite judgment. The thing that's a little weird about it is that if you really simply say it at this level of abstraction, the P can stand in for all properties, right? And so if I say that there is not an X, I'm sorry, there is an X such that X has no properties. It's a sort of odd way to think about the sense in which something exists. By the way, there's also the possibility of doing this, which is yet a further way of saying it. It is not the case that something is P, is what this is. And in the first one, I'm simply saying that there is nothing that has property P. In the last one, I'm saying something similar. It is not the case that something has property P. And in the middle one, I'm saying it is the case that something has property non-P. Now that's really weird, isn't it? It is the case that something has property non-P. But that's exactly the structure that Bergson is talking about here, right? And he thinks that the self, understood on his account of rationalism, has exactly that structure, that there is a thing, the self, but what it is, I mean, the best we could say about it is that it's non-P. Right? Well, what is it then? Void, form without content, something like that, right? So now that we have kind of a formal description of it, Sandesh, you want to talk a little bit about what you remember about the ineffable, and maybe if you remember anything about Adorno and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm trying to tie this idea of like form without content, and
Yeah.
maybe like also talking about maybe, let's say, music or something, um, and trying to I don't know, just taking, like, let's say, um, musical analysis, for example, where have this direct sensation or experience with sound, and then we try to break it down, this experience, into various concepts and whatnot. Um, and then basically, exact same thing what Bergson is saying, where like even the simple example we took of the movement of the hand, when it's perceived as like this continuous thing. And then if we think of it as, no, actually it's like this point, and then this point, and this point, and this point, and then after the addition of all these points is when you get
Yeah.
well,
I don't know. Maybe the formal description, I hope it's not too complicated. For me, it actually makes things really clear. Maybe just because there are a bunch of weird symbols, it seems unclear. But we could go back to like Kant and what he has to say about synthesis and what goes on in, say, reflective judgment when you experience something aesthetically. Here's one way to talk about these logical forms or these propositional forms in terms of synthesis and not in terms of a descriptive sentence. So just to make that clear, up until now with the existential quantifier, I've been phrasing it in terms of a claim about existence. There is an X such that it has property non-P.
Yeah.
But really what Kant is saying is that it's at the level of constitutive judgment, it's not a claim about existence. It's simply the structure of synthesis of objects. So what that would mean, here's another way to bring concepts in. Where would the concept, where would the concept typically go? S or P? In, say, the form S is P, where would the concept go?
like go as in get attached to, or go.
Well, what S and P have no content. They're just like variables at this point, right? Okay, so is the what variable would be filled by the concept? The X
P,
or the P? What?
P,
Say it again, I can't hear you.
P.
T?
No. The concept would be P.
P, exactly, P. Okay, let's look at this for a second. Okay, so one way to say that is that concepts, by definition, are general, right? If I say, look, I have a dog, and maybe you guys have dogs, and actually they're really different, but in what sense are they the same? They're the same to the extent that they can be subsumed under the concept dog. So the concept dog isn't particular, it subsumes particulars into it, right? The concept dog is general. Okay, so my dog's name is Harvey. Okay, Harvey is an individual. And so since Harvey is an individual, Harvey will be S, the subject. And this is actually something that comes from Aristotle. Aristotle says that substances are the things that accept the predicates, basically, when he says that it's that which accepts contraries. One of the consequences of that is that it's the individual that can accept the predicate, right?
Mhm.
The predicate could be blue and white, right? But the thing that accepts both blue and white would be the substance. In grammar, it's called the subject. But in any case, the subject is usually the thing of which something is predicated. So I can say Harvey is a dog. But if I say something like dog is Harvey, that doesn't really make sense, right? I'm saying that the general class of things, dog, is this one dog.
Mhm.
That doesn't make any sense, right? It makes sense if I say this one thing here is a dog, S is P. But if I put the concept in the subject position and the particular in the predicate position, it's really weird. Dog is this thing right here.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe if it's a proper name, that would work, but proper names aren't strictly speaking concepts because they're not general, right? You can do this with any concept. It's very weird if I say something like uh, and you should not be confused by grammar because when we speak poetically, we often shift word order and so on. But you really got to think about like what is the relationship between the concept and the thing that is supposed to be the example of the concept. Um, you know, well, anyway, I hope that's clear.
Yeah.
I could give you a lot more examples, but that's basically the idea. And so uh, we often think, okay, the subject is the thing, the object, right? It's the thing that I'm synthesizing, and I synthesize it together with its properties, its P, its predicates. So when I synthesize this as an object, to the extent that I synthesize it under a concept, cup, that would be like an affirmative judgment, right? I synthesize it as this thing that has these properties, and the properties are part of what enable me to subsume it under the concept cup.
Mhm.
What Kant says about aesthetic judgment, however, is that when you um, experience a thing aesthetically and you synthesize it, what you're paying attention to are all its particular properties, its status as a unique, distinct thing. And a way to describe that intuitively is that, think about your experience of, let's say I don't know, like look at any object you want as a work of art. To the extent that you're experiencing it aesthetically, you're experiencing this experience at this time of this object. And just because all of that is sort of essential to the apprehension of it as an aesthetic object, it's all individual, it's all unique. It's this experience now,
Mhm.
right? But just because it's unique is not generalized. It's not generalizable. It's just if it's essential that an aesthetic experience be unique or individual or sort of indexical, it's exactly this experience at exactly this time. And if that's essential, then it's not conceptual.
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Mhm.
Okay. But it's not like when you see an object as a work of art that it's just a bunch of random, unconnected impressions that have no structure whatsoever. There really is an object here. It's just you take the object as not falling under a concept. Well, if we say that the P is where the concept goes, and if I experience this thing aesthetically as an object not falling under a concept, then I have the structure S is non-P, right?
Mhm.
Is that clear? Okay. So that's the way that this plays a role in Kant's aesthetics. But the idea is sort of that, okay, so when you experience a thing as beautiful, for instance, you experience it as cohering, as hanging together, and yet in a way that you would never be able to talk about because it's by definition non-conceptual.
Mhm.
If we understand concept simply as like a defining generalization, an abstract generalization like dog or whatever. right? And so that explains the ineffability of an aesthetic judgment. It's not ineffable because it either doesn't exist or it's somehow just totally bewildering and not unified and just whatever. No, it does have definite shape, but just because you take the shape and the properties of the object as unique, distinct, this experience at this time, if that's essential, it's not a concept. And yet it's real for you, but it's not the sort of thing that you could then put into words or put into concepts or that sort of thing. And so from that tradition, there are a variety of different thinkers that say that it's not just aesthetic judgment that has that structure. It's all sorts of typically evaluative domains of life. So if you ever read the work of Martin Buber, who is a contemporary of Henri Bergson, he talks about morality or ethics in this way, that if you want to be ethical to another person, first of all, ethics is not really the sort of thing that you can get to through systems of ethics. You know, administrated ethics. Ethics is a way of describing the way that people really do interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And one of the things he says is that a precondition for treating another person ethically is to treat them as a unique individual that is not exhausted by the concepts that you might apply to them. Like if, we have an argument and they say, well, you only mean that because you're like a wealthy East Coast, whatever, what I'm doing is applying concepts to you and assuming that those concepts exhaust who you are.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to treat someone ethically, you have to meet them where they are, not assume that they're just an instance of these concepts, but rather that they're this person right now who I'm engaging with in this way. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it has the same basic structure as what Kant has to say about the structure of aesthetic judgment. And I'd say that one thing that comes out of that when you look at, say, Adorno, right, is this idea that when he talks about the preponderance of the object and the desire to somehow have an identity that's not reduced to concepts, which he describes as the non-identical, it's this idea of, we've talked about it last week too, but it's this idea of wanting to make a place for yourself in a society without at the same time reducing the inexhaustible heterogeneity of your experience to these abstract concepts. Mm-hmm. Right. And so then again, you have the same basic structure. There is a core to your identity. There is a core of your experience that is real, right? That is your lived experience. And yet, if you then try to conceptualize it so that you say, well, now I am, I don't know, choose your I don't know what the most current sort of new concepts are, new social concepts, but like it goes across the political spectrum, right? I mean, it's not only on the left that people want to assert new concepts, new identities, and that kind of thing. I mean, I'd say that Trump voters, if you think about the way that the Republican base kind of morphed from fiscally conservative Christian, whatever people to what they are now, to the extent that they assert their identity as MAGA conservatives. That's a new identity, a new concept that's been forged to somehow fit, conceptualize, generalize the experience of these people that didn't have a word, didn't have a concept before. Mm-hmm. Right. But the idea is that to be true to your freedom and spontaneity as a human being, you have to always resist the sort of standardizing, generalizing hegemony of concepts, because concepts always strip away the detail and the actuality of experience. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so that's kind of the concept of the self that Bergson, I think, is talking about here, where, yeah, there is a self, but the self is the sort of thing that we can only define negatively,
Mhm.
right? We can say what it isn't. It's not a concept. It's not these properties or whatever, but defining it negatively doesn't really, one problem with defining things negatively is it doesn't really characterize the sense of selfhood as vibrant, creative, alive, right? It's just this sort of empty sort of shadow, this void. When he, yeah, the way that I put it in my notes is that it quantifies over a void. So in other words, it says that there is a thing, but that thing is nothing. That's just the structure of, you know, there is an X such that non-PX,
Mhm.
right? Whereas what Bergson wants to say is that you don't have to think about the self as nothing. You can just think about it as no thing, but something else,
Mhm.
right? Other than a thing, pure duration, creative life, this sort of thing, right?
Mhm.
Um, Difference in itself and so on. Okay. So yeah, those are some very important ideas in Bergson up to this point. I think it'd be good for the rest of the time to talk a little bit about the propositions that he enumerates. There are 9 of them because they're kind of in a way a summary, but I would also like to talk about some of the things he has to say about Kant, just because
Yeah.
it's interesting for me. But uh,
I
he talks
wonder if
about,
we spoke about
yeah,
Kant.
sorry, go ahead, Sandesh.
I wonder if we jump to Kant, we can maybe type uh, that back to the propositions in some way.
Yeah, because he does go straight from the propositions to a discussion of Kant. So they're really, and I would say that it's a little bit easier to get to his position on Kant uh, if you read Time and Free Will, because that's really where he talks a lot about the Kantian conception of freedom and so on. But you can get a flavor for it here as well. What doesn't he like about Kant? I'll just throw it out to you. I will say that there are many ways in which he is indebted to Kant.
Yeah.
And there are many ways in which, despite that, he wants to take issue with certain assumptions Kant makes. And there are a couple places where he just gets Kant wrong. But um, let's talk about what he takes issue with.
I guess, well, to generalize it, it's like that Kant goes from concepts to intuition. And that by what, I don't
That's
know
not
if,
quite right. That's not quite right. But continue. And
so
Bergson doesn't exactly claim that either.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
that actually, what is this important is to understand that concepts and intuition are distinct in Kant, but that both concepts and intuition are constitutive of experience, so that
Yeah,
you can't really have experience without concepts.
right. Maybe I should have said experience actually.
Yeah,
That
okay.
concepts to
But why
experience.
don't, just for Justin's sake, we summarize really briefly what the difference is in Kant between intuition and concepts, intuition and understanding.
Yeah, intuition is like the most basic form of cognition, just like pure sense data. It doesn't have any concepts attached to it.
What are the pure forms of intuition in Kant? Do you remember?
Pure forms of
Or two of them?
uh oh, space and time.
Yes, space and time. They're pure forms of intuition. This might be a little bit of an advanced question, but why does Kant want to call space and time mere forms of intuition? What does he get out of that? What does it make possible?
He well, he's sort of displacing the origin of experience from the world into the
Mhm.
subject.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true.
And
Yeah, it's fine. It's an advanced question, I suppose, to really get at it. But there are 3 critiques that Kant famously writes: the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. The critique of pure reason asks this question: is metaphysics possible? The way he asks it is, are synthetic judgments possible a priori? We won't worry about what that means. What it basically means is, are there things that we can know about the world that we know just by thinking? That's what that means. Are there things we can know about the world? Not just the structure of our thought, like 1 = 1, but are there things we can know about the world that we can know simply by thinking, or at least is there a component in what we know about the world that is a priori, that we just know because of the structure of thought? And that is what he means by metaphysics. The reason that that's metaphysical is that if you want to say that something is mind independently real, in other words, you're making a synthetic claim about reality, are there elements to that claim that you know without experiencing the world, right? In other words, you know what must be the case. What are the conditions of possibility for certain claims about the world? And those conditions of possibility are going to be metaphysical, right? But in any case, that's what he asks in the first one. So it's really a question, what can we know?
Yeah.
What can we know, say, about science, about the world, and so on? The second one, the critique of practical reason, is about what should we do? What is morality, right? Now, here's the problem, right? Okay, so Kant is basically a Newtonian. He was also an astronomer before he wrote any philosophy. He was the first person who conjectured that the Andromeda galaxy was another galaxy. Sort of interesting. He called it an island universe. But anyway, he did a lot of astronomy before that. But he was a good Newtonian. And one of the things that was made evident by Newtonian physics is that for every event, there is a cause. In other words, everything is determined, right? So Newtonian physics has a strong deterministic ontology. Everything that happens because of causal interactions between matter and forces. Okay, so if that's true, if determinism is true, that sort of strong physical determinism is true, and we are also subject to physical determination, is it possible to be free? Is it possible to have freedom? And the reason that we would want freedom is because Kant thinks without freedom, you can't be moral.
Mm-hmm.
You're just no different from a rock or any other thing that you wouldn't think does good or evil or anything. It's just, we're all just kind of, in some sense, automatons or something like that. Okay, so basically what motivates him to make space and time forms of intuition and not mind independently real is that where does physics operate? It operates within the domains of space and time.
Mm-hmm.
So if space and time are simply the way that we shape our experience of the world, but they're not actually in the world mind independently, then physical determination is only operative within our intuition of the world,
Mm-hmm.
which means that there's going to be a sphere of mind independent reality beyond space and time that, at least in principle, freedom is possible. Right? Because determination is only with reference to space and time. Space and time are empirically real. We really do experience the world in terms of space and time, but they're transcendentally ideal. In other words, they're not there in the world. They're in the way that we construct the world in our experience of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason that he wants to make space and time forms of intuition is to save morality, make it possible for freedom to exist, right? Okay, so that's what intuition is in Kant. Intuition is basically that part of experience that constantly schematizes things in terms of space and time. That all experience is always temporal. Even when we think thoughts, we think them in time. Certainly, whenever we see something out in the world, we think of it as being in both space and time, right? But all of those things are space and time are descriptive of how we must necessarily experience the world, but we don't know. In fact, Kant thinks he has an argument to show that, in fact, reality outside of how we experience it is not spatial and is not temporal. Okay,
Oh, you mean the noumenal world?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, the noumenal. So space and time refer only to phenomena, which means experience. Noumena are the noumenal is that which um, exists without reference to experience, right? I don't necessarily want to suggest that there's like a different spatial location where there's the noumenal and the phenomenal is like the phenomenal is on Earth and the noumenal is out in space. That's not how it works, right? Because the noumenal is just non-spatial,
Mhm.
right? It's also non-temporal, right? Um, the way you would describe its relationship to time from, say, contemporary physics is that it's an eternalist conception of time, not that it's not eternal in the sense that we have today and tomorrow and the next day on to an infinity. It's just there is no time. It's not temporal at all. Sort of
Mhm.
irrelevant to talk about. So if I say that, 1 = 1, I don't have to appeal to time to justify 1 = 1, right? It might be that you always have the thought 1 = 1 in time. But if I want to give you a defense for why I think 1 = 1, I don't have to say, well, because there used to be this thing called one, and then this thing called equals came along, and then they had some fun together, and then we got this proposition out of it that 1 = 1. No, I don't have to talk about time at all.
Mhm.
I simply have to talk about the formal definition.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so Kant thinks that space and time are mere forms of intuition, and he does that because he wants to save freedom so that he can have morality. Okay.
That's the freedom. So the fact that we have pure intuitions of space and time means that that's where freedom originates. Like, is that what
No,
you're?
no, no, no. Although that's closer to what Bergson is going to argue, but no. Okay. Here's the debate in contemporary terms. This is what Robert Sapolsky is writing about these days. Free will doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Why doesn't it exist? Because I can show that everything that happens when you think that you're making a choice is actually a physical event. And because it's a physical event, I can always give you the cause. And because I can always give you the cause, you didn't choose it.
Right.
Is that clear? Well, Kant thinks if I didn't choose to do X, Y, or Z or anything,
Mhm.
then it's not moral at all.
Yeah.
In order for something to be moral, I have to be able to have the freedom to have done otherwise,
Mhm.
right? Like if I go over to your house and murder you right now, and then the police are like, or the judge is like, "You evil person, why did you do that?" And it's like, maybe you owe me money or something, right? Maybe I have a reason, but the reason doesn't rise to the level of an ethical reason, right? And so you say, well, you could have thought about it. You could have chosen not to kill poor Sandesh or whatever, right? Um, the idea that it's moral requires that I be able to, one, reason about it, and two, act in some other way. Because if it's impossible for me to act in any other way, if everything's determined, then I'd never had a choice. And so it's not evil. Here's a way to look at it. If you're hiking and some mugger comes up and kills you, that's evil. If a rock falls down and crushes you, that's not evil.
Mhm.
Well, you still died.
Yeah.
Something caused your death
Yep.
in both cases. Why is one evil and the other isn't?
Mhm.
Well, it's because the rock is only subject to determinism. It has no mental states or anything like that, or mental processes or whatever. The mugger, presumably because the mugger's human, can reason, can think about alternate courses of action, and has to choose either to kill you or not. Because they have that choice, we can say that it was immoral or unethical to kill you. If they didn't have the choice, if they were crazy, we wouldn't say that they acted immorally. We would say they need medication,
Mhm.
right? So that, on the insanity defense, insanity just means that a person acts like a rock.
Yeah.
They're just subject to causal determinacy.
Mhm.
It's only when you have the rational capacity and the capacity to freely make a choice, that it makes any sense to talk about morality. Okay? That's clear, right? Now, if it's the case that we are, as Newton and most biologists can rightly point out, all subject to causal determination, even though they don't have a complete causal chain, right? I mean, there are always gaps in any causal account, but nonetheless, if Robert Sapolsky can show that when you gave a flower to that 5-year-old, you thought you were being nice, you thought you were being a good person. No, you weren't. There are certain biological drives, certain biological um, motivations. And anyway, at the neuronal level, we can give you a pretty complete map of all of the causal chain that had the consequence of you giving the person the flower, the 5-year-old the flower. So you didn't really choose it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what Kant then says is, okay, well, the thing about causal determinism is that it only operates with respect to space and time. Whenever I say, well, that neuron fired at time t and moved to this location, L, that happened at a time, traversed some time span, came to a new point in space, it's only with respect to space and time that determination makes any sense whatsoever. Not because there's something about the definition of whatever life or even something like neuron that has space and time built into it. That when you talk about causality, physical causality, it only can operate within space and time. It always has to be relative to space and time. And another way that people often talk about causality is in terms of reasons. So, like for instance, I might think that I'm giving the 5-year-old a flower because it will make the 5-year-old happy, and that's my reason. I think I want to make this person happy, so I'll give them a flower. What Sapolsky would say is, well, you think that that's a reason, but the reason is really just a representation of this underlying causal mechanism, right? And so the question is, are reasons the same sort of cause as physical causality? And the idea from Kant on is that no, they're not. There are two ways of describing the same action. And so any action that is motivated by a reason will also have, you can always describe it in terms of cause and effect on a physical level. But just because it's a reason, it's not a physical cause, because reasons aren't physical. Right? Reasons aren't temporal, really. If you think that, logic exists sort of simultaneous, all true propositions exist simultaneously is a way of sort of saying this, right? Well, all analytic propositions, I should say, exist simultaneously, right? But the idea is that, space and time, the reason that he wants to make that distinct from reasons is that causal determinacy only operates with respect to space and time and not with respect to reasons, right? So if there is a domain of reasoning that is not essentially spatial or temporal, then that's a freedom, that's a space within which freedom can operate. Because if the only reason to say that we have no freedom is that everything is subject to causal determinacy, then if I say, well, yeah, but causal determinacy is always relative to space and time, and reasons aren't, then I can say freedom is possible in the space of reasons, right? Okay. So that's Kant's picture of intuition. And it's not just to save morality. It's also, to a certain extent, to save physics, because one of the things that arises out of Kant's picture is an answer to Hume's skepticism about causality. One of the things that Hume says about causality, I said this last time, is that you have a ball hit another ball, and you think the first ball caused the second ball to move, but you never saw the cause. There was no observation in any of that of a third thing, the cause. There's this ball's movement, but there's not a third thing, the cause. So Hume says causality is just a kind of habit of mind. It's a kind of lazy habit of thinking. We see this happen, we see another thing happen a bunch of times, and we just sort of lazily infer that there's this necessary metaphysical connection, causality.
Mhm.
Causality doesn't really exist. And what Kant says is that causality really does exist, but it exists because it's one of the things that makes experience possible. If you didn't already impose the idea or the category of causality, you would never have experience to begin with. Whenever I experience two things in any relationship at all, or even if I just experience one thing at all and I don't impute any causal uh, antecedents or consequence to it, I still experience it as an to experience it as an object is to experience it as possibly subject to causal interaction,
Mhm.
right? Um, that's what it means to see something as an object. That it, yeah, it. I mean, for instance, if you could see the fact that one way to think about this is you see this as an object, but you see it as a finite object. And in fact, in order to see it as an object at all, you have to see it as finite. You couldn't see it as infinite.
Mhm.
Well, that means that, for instance, with respect to time, you always immediately impute a beginning to this thing,
Mhm.
right? Because it's finite,
Mhm.
right? There's no way that you could ever experience a thing as an infinite object. In fact, that's a contradiction in terms. To experience it as an object is to experience it as finite. And one of the ways it's finite is that you immediately um, impute the aptness of this thing with respect to the chain of cause and effect.
Mhm.
I hope that's clear. I mean, it gets kind of complicated when we really go down the rabbit hole, but the main thing is to understand that essentially Kant thinks that time is imaginary. And
Mhm.
that's one of the big problems that Bergson has with Kant. And it's not just that Kant thinks that time is imaginary, he thinks it has to be imaginary in order for us to have freedom, right?
Mhm.
That much is clear, right? Why
Yeah.
do you, yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Is Kant, would you say he's a compatibilist when it comes to free will then?
Yeah, he's
Like,
a compatibilist. I mean, basically what he says is that, as I tried to summarize earlier, anytime you act in a reasoned way, it's always possible to describe it in terms of physics, essentially. But that's not an exhaustive description of the action because any action that you freely do, any action that you choose to do, you can also describe in terms of motivational reasons, right? But reasons, just because they're not spatial, they're
Mhm.
not physical,
Mhm.
right? Which is to say that, it can get complicated, and I don't want to waste more time with, theories of mind and that kind of thing. But that's basically the picture, right? Okay. And all of that together gives us the two main things that Bergson wants to criticize Kant for. Um, Given what you know about what Bergson has to say about time in terms of pure duration, as like, pure duration is really the essential feature of our selfhood. It's the feature that we can access through intuition, what he calls intuition, which is that sort of intellectual sympathy,
Mhm.
right? I can experience my own being or my own perception or whatever as pure duration, that continuous heterogeneity. And because of that, I can then also imagine what it would be like to be a rock or to be a river or whatever,
Mhm.
right? That's kind of the idea. Okay, so he's got a different definition of intuition, but he has a really different understanding of the importance of time than Kant. Because if you take time to be pure duration, Bergson would want to say that um, time is not just imaginary, right? Time is that thing that makes it possible for us to have this sort of unity with the rest of reality. Time understood as pure duration and not as like clock time.
Mhm.
Okay. So maybe I'll just start talking. I'll keep talking. I try to like get you guys to generate some responses. But maybe you can try to kind of think about why Bergson thinks that contra Kant, freedom is only possible in time. Kant says freedom is only possible if we posit that time is imaginary.
Mm.
Bergson says freedom is only possible if time is real. Why? And time here meaning pure duration. Why?
Would it be that there's nothing outside of pure duration?
Well, that's possible. Yeah, sure. I mean, if if all reality, like the true reality beyond concepts or before concepts or whatever, is all there is, and we have freedom, then freedom must be part of it. That's probably true. Let's try to get it a little bit more of a specific answer. Um, I think the argument has a lot to do with causality, theories about causality, physical causality, right? Okay, so you know that physical causality and causal determinism for Kant only operates in space and time. Bergson has a slightly different way to talk about it, and it brings him closer to Schopenhauer. It has to do with the idea that by definition, a cause cannot be the same thing as its effect. They have to be distinct things.
Mhm.
Just think about it. Whenever you say, like, I don't know, like whatever, this billiard ball hits this apple and the apple moves. Well, let's say the cause is this action and the effect is this action. They have to be different things. If it's all the same thing, then you don't have an explanation anymore,
Mhm.
right? In order to have the explanation, you have to posit that causes and effects are different things. You can distinguish them. In fact, you necessarily distinguish them,
Mhm.
right? Okay. So now think about what Bergson has to say about distinction, conceptual distinction as a sort of imaginary thing,
Mhm.
right? Um, does causality exist in pure duration?
I would say no.
Why not?
Well, because then for causality to exist, you need this process of division, you need things
Yeah,
separate, but that's not how he defines duration.
that's
Uh,
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So just because duration is continuous and not distinct in the sense that you need distinction in order to have the concept cause and the concept effect, there is no causality in duration.
mhm.
Well, just because there's no causality in duration, freedom is possible. But it's only possible if you understand duration as this continuity, right? That is to say, not a separate cause and its effect, but just this continuity that shifts and changes and whatever, right? But it's within that because we no longer have to distinguish between cause and effect, that the whole idea of causality becomes incoherent. If we think that causality, at least as an explanation, requires that sort of conceptual distinction, well, if concepts aren't real, right? If concepts are imaginary, then what we have is a space that's similar to what Kant is describing, except that um, it's necessarily temporal in the sense of changing, shifting, whatever, but it's changing and shifting in a continuous way. Now, there's another thing that Bergson doesn't like about Kant, and that has to do with his metaphysics, what he has to say about the understanding. Right. Okay. So we talked about the way the intuition is different for Bergson. What about the understanding? And he talks about how Kant dethrones Plato only to give him another throne in the mind. What does all that mean?
need to look up. I forget where. Is is he talking about like the ideal forms and stuff? Is that what he's?
What's that?
Yeah, I don't remember where exactly that was.
Well, just do a search for Plato, and you'll probably
Oh,
find.
okay.
Yeah, the first one that comes up is right around the area that I'm talking about. Okay, well, you don't have to really read what he writes. We can kind of infer it from the description that I've given so far, right? Let's say I talk about causality, right? Okay, so Kant says that the concept or the using the word concept is a little bit uh, inaccurate, but actually that's the way that Bergson talks about Kant. So let's just use the word concept. The concept causality is constitutive of our experience. That's something that Kant claims. And I told you why a second ago, right? Why is causality constitutive of experience? Justin?
Uh, because we have a propulsive reason to do things that exist outside of time and space.
Nope, that's a different thing.
Oh, okay.
You see this as an object, right? I'm holding an object. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Okay. Do you see this object as infinite?
Oh, no, because it's, yes. Okay, I see.
Yeah, to see it as an object is to posit a number of limitations, including the idea that it is in principle subject to the chain of cause and effect. Anything that you can observe, by the way, is subject to that. Anything that would not be subject to the chain of cause and effect is by definition unobservable. That's why you can't see God, for instance, right? Yeah, so to see anything at all as an object is to immediately already posit its aptness in the chain of cause and effect. Okay, so, but causality is a concept, according to the way that Bergson paraphrases Kant, okay? So it's not just causality. It turns out there are a bunch of other concepts that make experience possible. That's the problem that Bergson has with Kant. He thinks that concepts underlie experience. But Bergson just said concepts are something we apply to intuitive experience in a way to kind of get at it, but we don't really get at it. It's not that they underlie it. It's not that intuition is constituted by concepts. Certainly not. Intuition is immediate. Intuition is the real deal, right? It's really the way that we experience the world and ourselves and so on. Concepts are a really rough sort of grid that we place on experience in order to be able to analyze it or talk about it and so on, right? And so that's really the problem. He thinks that Kant is saying that just because experience is constituted by concepts and concepts aren't spatial or temporal, they're kind of eternal, right? I mean, the if you take, for instance, the law of identity, Aristotle's law of identity, you can say that in a Kantian judgment form, S is P, A is A. It's just that the A is also the predicate, right? A is A. That's just the law of identity. The law of identity doesn't change. In fact, it'd be impossible to talk about it as changing because you'd have to reference it. And to reference it is to reference the thing you're referencing, right? So just because identity understood in that way is a concept, it doesn't change. Well, if concepts don't change and concepts are constitutive of experience, then what is real is that which doesn't change, right? It's like experience is actually something that's derived from, or at least partially dependent on, unchanging concepts, right? That's the argument that Bergson's making here. And that's why he doesn't like Kant. But what he thinks is that no, I don't even know if Bergson would say it's the other way around. Deleuze certainly says it's the other way around. I'm not sure about Bergson. What Deleuze says is that, he's doing a transcendental argument that will get underneath Kant's transcendental argument. And I should say a word about what transcendental arguments are. Sandesh,
I
what's a
have to go. Oh, I have to go teach.
okay, you got to teach. Okay, well, that's
Yeah.
fine. What time
Yeah.
do you start?
I need to be. I'm at home, so I need to drive to school at 10.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case,
But
let me just say 2 minutes because it will segue into Deleuze, who I guess we should read next time. So a transcendental argument is just this. You take phenomenon X and you ask, what are the conditions of possibility for X? It's a little different from a constructive argument. Like if I were to say, okay, I first take some axiom and then that axiom spits out theorems, and then at some point up the chain, I get the phenomenon that we want to talk about. Transcendental arguments go the opposite direction. You just assume the thing, like experience. And then you say, okay, we know we have experience. So then what are the conditions of possibility for experience? That's what a transcendental argument is. It takes some phenomenon or something that you take to be true, you just grant it's true, and then you say, what are its necessary conditions? And what Kant says is that we have experience. What are its necessary conditions? Well, all these concepts like causality, like affirmation, negation, possibility, necessity, all this kind of stuff, these concepts have to be in place in order for us to have experience. Next time, maybe I'll give you the argument for that, but that's the idea. What Deleuze is going to say is that that's not really sufficient because he wants to know how these identities, these concepts arise in the first place. And so he's going to ask, what are the necessary conditions for Kant's categories? And what he's going to say is difference, which is similar to Bergson's intuition, is a necessary condition for those concepts to be possible.
yeah,
Is that clear?
yeah. So
Okay.
Kant is trying to find, I guess, in Bergson's words, mobility in immobility, right? So you can think of concepts and all these things as being immobile because they're fixed, and he's trying to somehow find this continuous whatever experience, etc. The immobile from the mobile.
Yeah, well, Kant would say that the change of experience is probably due to the forms of intuition, time. But beneath time, the temporal schemata, you've got the regularities of the concepts. And by the way, the regularities of the concepts are what enables us to experience the world as being subject to laws like gravity and all the physical laws, right? That is something that emerges out of the fixed nature of the concepts, right? And Kant thinks that all the change of experience, there's going to be some basic core. It's like what Aristotle has to say about substance is that which persists through change. Kant would say the categories are that which persists through changing experience. Right. That's anyway the way that Bergson argues. Although there are a lot of arguments that Kant is doing something different, and maybe next time I'll say a little bit more about that. Good. See you.
Well,
Yeah. Oh, by the way, before you leave, let's just talk about Deleuze's Bergsonism, the first chapter, next time. Yeah. All right. See you later. Justin, did you want to stick around for a minute, or are you good?
Yeah. So, is our lesson happening now?
Well, we should probably just reschedule the lesson because we need
Okay.
a couple hours for this.
Yeah.
So, what days are good for you?
So this would be for going forward the rest of the quarter.
I'd say, yeah.
Okay, let me look at my schedule. Um,
I like morning times. So any morning that you're free would be good for me, except Friday.
yeah,
Let me also stop the recording here. How do I do that?